The heat in New Orleans hung thick as molasses that August morning in 1851. Beneath the iron balconies of the French Quarter, where bougainvillea crawled up whitewashed walls and the smell of chicory coffee mixed with horse manure and human sweat, a different kind of commerce unfolded in the shadow of St. Louis Cathedral. The auction house on Chartres Street had seen thousands pass through its doors. Men, women, children, all reduced to livestock, all measured by the strength of their backs and the color of their skin. On the auction block stood a girl of 17. Her name was Celeste, though names meant little in this place. She had skin the color of polished mahogany, high cheekbones that spoke of mixed heritage, and eyes that refused to look down even as rough hands turned her this way and that for inspection. She'd been born on a plantation upriver, sold at age 2 to a cotton farm in Mississippi, then resold after the master's death to pay his gambling debts. She'd learned early that survival meant silence, that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. What none of the bidders crowding the auction floor knew, what even Celeste herself didn't know, was that the man examining her with cold calculation had fathered her 18 years ago in a cabin behind the sugar mill at Magnolia Plantation. Thomas Beaumont had forgotten that night. He'd forgotten many nights like it. The enslaved woman he'd used, a girl named Lizette with French blood and African ancestry, had died in childbirth before anyone thought to record the baby's parentage. The infant girl had been sold away before she could walk, one more transaction in a ledger book, one more mouth the plantation didn't need to feed. Now fate had brought them back together, and neither recognized the other. Thomas Beaumont stood near the back of the crowd, 43 years old, prosperous, respected among the planter class. His sugar plantation produced 60 hogsheads per acre. His wife came from Charleston aristocracy. His 3 legitimate children attended the finest schools. He wore success like his tailored coat, comfortable, expected, unquestioned. But his wife had been sickly lately, distant, cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. A man had needs, and Louisiana law gave him every right to satisfy them however he chose. The auctioneer's voice rose above the crowd. Fine specimen here, gentlemen. Young, healthy, no visible defects. Literate, can read and write, which adds value for household management. Starting bid at $800. Hands rose. The price climbed. Thomas studied Celeste's face, searching for defiance, searching for spirit. He'd learned that the ones with fire made the most satisfying conquests. Something about her profile nagged at him, a familiarity he couldn't place, like a melody heard long ago and half forgotten. He dismissed the thought. All these people looked alike after a while. The bidding reached $1,300. Thomas raised his hand lazily, adding another 100. The room fell quiet. Everyone knew Beaumont's wealth. Nobody challenged him when he wanted something. The gavel fell. Sold to Mr. Thomas Beaumont of Magnolia Plantation. Celeste's shoulders tensed, the only sign she'd heard. She'd learned not to react, not to show fear or hope or anything that could be used against her. But standing there in her rough cotton dress, hands bound loosely at her wrists, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her like chains heavier than any iron. Thomas approached the block, handed over a bank draft, and received the papers that made Celeste his legal property. He looked up at her once, briefly, meeting her eyes. "You'll do well at Magnolia," he said. "I take care of what's mine." She said nothing. What was there to say? If this story moves you, if you believe these histories need to be told and remembered, take a moment now to subscribe. Your support ensures stories like Celeste's don't disappear into silence. As Thomas led her to the wagon waiting outside, Celeste took one last look at the auction house. She'd heard stories about men who bought young women for specific purposes. She wasn't naive. She knew what was coming. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the man walking ahead of her, counting coins in his leather purse, was the same man whose blood ran through her veins. That the plantation she was being taken to was the same soil where she'd drawn her first breath. That history was about to repeat itself in the cruelest way imaginable. The wagon rolled north, away from the city, toward the river and the endless fields of sugarcane. Celeste sat in the back, watching New Orleans fade behind her, unaware that she was traveling toward a truth that would destroy everything. The journey upriver took 2 days. The Mississippi River churned brown and endless beside them, carrying silt from 1,000 tributaries, indifferent to the human cargo moving along its banks. Celeste sat in the back of the wagon, wrists no longer bound but freedom still impossibly distant. Thomas Beaumont rode ahead on a chestnut mare, his white linen suit somehow remaining crisp despite the oppressive August heat that made the air shimmer above the water. They passed other plantations, sprawling estates with names like Belle Grove and Oak Alley, each one a kingdom unto itself, each one built on the same foundation of forced labor and generational trauma. Celeste watched the enslaved workers in the fields, bent low over cotton and cane, and wondered if her fate would be better or worse than theirs. At least in the fields, you knew what was expected. You broke your back. You survived another day. What awaited her felt more uncertain, more dangerous in ways she didn't yet fully understand. Magnolia Plantation announced itself long before they arrived. First came the smell, that distinctive sweetness of sugarcane mixed with smoke from the sugar mill. Then the land itself changed, becoming more manicured, more deliberately arranged. Live oaks lined the approach road, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hung like widows' veils. The main house rose 3 stories at the end of the oak alley, its columns gleaming white in the afternoon sun, a temple built to worship wealth extracted from human suffering. But Celeste wasn't taken to the main house. She wasn't taken to the quarters either, those rows of wooden cabins behind the sugar mill where 200 enslaved people lived in conditions that would shame a barn. Instead, the wagon stopped at a small cottage tucked between the main house and the overseer's residence. It was painted white, had real glass windows, and stood apart from everything else, isolated in a way that felt both privileged and ominous. An elderly black woman waited at the cottage door. Her hair had gone completely white, pulled back in a tight bun that emphasized the deep lines etched into her face. She wore a clean apron over a dark dress, and her eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much, surviving too long. They called her Mama Ruth, and she'd been at Magnolia Plantation for 42 years. She'd arrived as a child, seen 3 generations of Beaumonts, buried more people than she could count. "This is where you'll stay," Ruth said, her voice neutral, carefully empty of emotion. She opened the cottage door and gestured inside. The interior was simple but clean. A real bed with sheets. A washstand with a ceramic basin. A small table with 2 chairs. A window that looked out toward the fields. For someone who'd spent recent years sleeping on pallets in crowded slave quarters, it seemed almost luxurious. But Celeste recognized it for what it was, a gilded cage. Ruth set down a pitcher of fresh water and a comb on the washstand. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if trying to delay the inevitable conversation. Finally, at the doorway, she paused and turned back. "Girl, you keep your head down and your mouth shut. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," Celeste answered. "What's your name?" "Celeste." Ruth's face twitched, just slightly, as if the name caused physical pain. "How old are you?" 17. "Near as I can figure." The old woman closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, they were wet. "Your mama. You ever know her name?" "No, ma'am. They told me she died when I was born. That's all I know." Ruth nodded slowly, her jaw tight. "You remember anything else?" "Where you were born." "Mississippi is the first place I remember. But I heard once I came from Louisiana originally. Don't know where exactly." The old woman's hands trembled on the doorframe. She wanted to speak, wanted to scream the truth, but 42 years of survival had taught her when to stay silent. "You be careful here," she said instead. "Real careful. Things ain't always what they seem." After Ruth left, Celeste explored her new prison. She ran her fingers along the bed frame, tested the chair's strength, looked out the window at the endless fields where sugarcane stood 8 feet high, ready for harvest. Somewhere in those fields, people who looked like her were working themselves to death. At least they had each other. At least they had community, however fragile. She had this cottage. This isolation. This waiting. That night, as the sun set and painted the sky the color of blood, Thomas Beaumont came to the cottage door. He carried a bottle of wine and 2 crystal glasses. He wore different clothes now, a silk waistcoat, expensive boots. He smelled of tobacco and bay rum cologne. He sat in the chair by the window, poured wine into both glasses, though he didn't offer her one. He just studied her in the lamplight, his eyes moving over her face, her hair, her body, with the casual ownership of someone examining property he'd just acquired. "What's your name again?" "Celeste, sir." He nodded slowly. That nagging familiarity troubled him again. Something in the angle of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. His mother had been Creole, with features like that. But no, that was impossible. This was just a slave girl. Nothing more. "You'll do well here, Celeste," he said. "I'm not a cruel man. I take care of what's mine. As long as you understand your place, as long as you don't cause trouble, you'll find life at Magnolia better than most." She said nothing. What could she say? That she understood her place was to be his whore? That she knew her body was now his property as surely as the land and the cane? She'd learned long ago that honesty was dangerous, that survival meant becoming whatever they needed you to be. Thomas stood, drained his wine glass, and set it on the table. "I'll visit tomorrow evening," he said. "Be ready." After he left, Celeste sat on the bed and stared at the closed door. She didn't cry. Tears were another luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she calculated. She planned. She prepared herself for what was coming, building walls around her heart that no man could breach, no matter what he did to her body. Outside, the plantation settled into its nightly rhythms. In the quarters, people sang songs that carried pain and hope in equal measure. In the main house, Thomas Beaumont's legitimate family ate dinner on fine china. And in the cottage, Celeste waited for a future that had already been written in blood and soil 18 years ago. Weeks passed like water over stone, slowly reshaping everything while appearing unchanged. Celeste learned the unspoken rules of her new existence with the same survival instinct that had carried her through 17 years of bondage. She was not to work in the fields where the sun beat down mercilessly and overseers carried whips. She was not to speak to the other enslaved people without explicit permission. She was not to leave the cottage except to walk in the small garden behind it. And she was to be available whenever Thomas Beaumont required her presence, which was most evenings after his wife retired with her laudanum and her silence. The other enslaved women at Magnolia watched her with complicated emotions. She wore dresses made of calico and cotton, not the rough Osnaburg fabric that scratched skin raw. She ate food from the main kitchen, cornbread with butter, sometimes chicken, occasionally even desserts. She slept alone in a bed with sheets that were washed weekly. From the outside, it might have looked like privilege. But everyone knew the price she paid for these small comforts. Among the field workers, opinions divided sharply. Some saw her as complicit, as someone who'd chosen comfort over solidarity. Others recognized the absence of choice, understood that in a system built on coercion, there were no good options, only different forms of survival. The men looked away when she passed, caught between desire and disgust, desire for what she represented, disgust for the man who possessed her. But Mama Ruth watched her with something else entirely. Horror mingled with guilt and helpless knowledge. One evening in late September, when the air finally cooled enough to breathe and the sugarcane harvest was beginning, Ruth came to the cottage with fresh linens. She'd been avoiding Celeste since that first day, sending younger women with supplies, finding excuses to stay away. But tonight she came herself, carrying sheets that smelled of lye soap and sunlight. Celeste sat by the window, mending one of Thomas's shirts. He'd asked her to learn sewing, to make herself useful beyond the bed. She'd complied as always, threading the needle with steady hands despite the trembling in her chest. "How old are you, child?" Ruth asked abruptly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Celeste looked up, surprised by the direct question. 17, ma'am. I think. Nobody kept exact records. Ruth's hands trembled as she set down the linens. 42 years she'd been at this plantation. 42 years of witnessing horrors that had no names, of carrying secrets that weighed more than chains. She'd delivered babies who were sold away before they could be weaned. She'd prepared bodies for burial, washing away the evidence of violence. She'd watched the Beaumont men, grandfather, father, now son, repeat the same patterns generation after generation, as if cruelty was inherited like the color of eyes. "Your mama," Ruth said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "You ever know her name?" Celeste shook her head, setting down the sewing. "Died when I was born. That's all they told me at the Mississippi plantation. Said I was bought as a baby, no family records." Ruth closed her eyes. She knew the name. Lisette. Beautiful Lisette with her French African features, her musical laugh that had died years before her body did. Lisette, who'd been Thomas Beaumont's favorite when he was 25 and newly in control of the plantation after his father's death. Lisette, who'd borne a daughter in the spring of 1834 and hemorrhaged to death 3 days later in a cabin that had since been torn down and rebuilt. Ruth had been there. She'd delivered the baby, a girl with caramel skin and features that were unmistakably mixed. She'd watched Thomas's face when he saw the child, that flash of recognition followed by deliberate erasure. He'd ordered the baby sold within the week. Too dangerous, he'd said, to keep evidence of his indiscretions so close. His new wife from Charleston was arriving in the fall, and he needed to appear respectable. "Why you asking about my mama?" Celeste asked, pulling Ruth back from memory. The old woman opened her eyes, looked directly at the girl, and felt the weight of what she knew crushing her chest. "Just curious," she lied. "You got a look about you. Familiar." Celeste nodded slowly, accepting the explanation but sensing something beneath it. "Do you know where in Louisiana I was born?" They said Louisiana originally, before Mississippi. Ruth's throat tightened. Lots of plantations in Louisiana. Hard to say. But Celeste was watching her now, really watching, her eyes sharp despite the careful neutrality she maintained. "Was it here?" she asked softly. "Was I born here at Magnolia?" The question hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Ruth wanted to speak the truth, wanted to grab this girl and run, wanted to undo 18 years of silence. But what would the truth accomplish? Celeste was already trapped. Telling her that the man who visited her bed each night, who touched her body with casual ownership, who whispered crude endearments in the dark, telling her that this man was her father wouldn't set her free. It would only add psychological torture to physical violation. "I don't know about that," Ruth said finally, gathering the old linens with shaking hands. "Like I said, lots of plantations." After she left, Celeste sat in the growing darkness, the shirt forgotten in her lap. Something about Ruth's reaction had confirmed what she'd started to suspect. There were secrets here, buried deep in Magnolia's soil. The way people looked at her, not just with pity but with horror. The way Thomas himself sometimes paused, studying her face with furrowed brow, as if trying to remember something just beyond reach. She'd learned to read people, to interpret silences and glances and the space between words. Survival depended on understanding what wasn't said. And what wasn't being said at Magnolia Plantation felt enormous, dangerous, like walking on ground that might collapse at any moment. In the main house, Thomas sat in his study with ledger books spread before him. The harvest was going well. prices were high. His wealth was growing. But he couldn't concentrate on the numbers. He kept thinking about the girl in the cottage, about the strange discomfort he felt in her presence. It wasn't guilt, he'd long ago silenced that voice. It was something else. Recognition that he couldn't quite place. A connection he didn't want to examine. He'd convinced himself it was just physical attraction, the natural pull of desire. But late at night, when he left her cottage and walked back to his bedroom where his wife slept in drug-induced oblivion, he sometimes caught himself wondering about her history. Where she'd come from. Who her parents were. The questions came unbidden and he pushed them away, unwilling to follow wherever they might lead. In the slave quarters, people whispered. Mama Ruth's distress hadn't gone unnoticed. The older enslaved people remembered Lizette, remembered the baby that had been sold away. They did the math, counted the years, looked at Celeste's face and saw the truth that Thomas Beaumont refused to see. But nobody spoke it aloud. Some truths were too dangerous to voice, even in whispers. So they watched, and they waited, and they prayed to a God who seemed to have abandoned this cursed ground long ago. This is the kind of history that textbooks erase, the stories that powerful people want forgotten. If you're still here, if you believe these truths matter, your subscription helps ensure they're told. Margaret Beaumont returned from Charleston in October, when the heat finally broke and the sugarcane stood 12 feet high, ready for harvest. She'd been gone 3 months, visiting her sister who'd recently been widowed, though everyone knew the real reason for her absence. Margaret was 38 years old and looked 50. Years of knowing what her husband did, years of swallowing silence with her breakfast and shame with her dinner, had carved deep lines into her face and extinguished whatever light her eyes had once held. She arrived in a carriage laden with trunks, accompanied by her lady's maid, a free woman of color named Josephine who'd served the family since Margaret's wedding day. As the carriage rolled up the Oakline Drive, Margaret looked out at the plantation with the resigned expression of someone returning to prison after a brief parole. Thomas waited on the front steps, dressed in his finest suit, playing the role of devoted husband. Their 3 children stood beside him. Thomas Jr., age 15, already showing his father's arrogance. Catherine, age 13, quiet and watchful. And little James, age 9, still innocent enough to genuinely smile at his mother's return. "Welcome home, my dear," Thomas said, offering his hand to help her down from the carriage. "We've missed you terribly." Margaret took his hand because she had to, allowed him to kiss her cheek because she had no choice. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice flat and colorless as old paint. That evening, the family dined together in the grand dining room where crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across mahogany furniture and silk wallpaper. The children chattered about their lessons, their riding, the new foal in the stable. Thomas discussed the harvest, the expected profits, his plans to expand the sugar mill. Margaret sat at the far end of the table, picking at her food, drinking wine that made the evening barely tolerable. After dinner, after the children had retired to their rooms, Thomas followed Margaret to her bedroom. She'd changed into a nightgown, brushed out her graying hair, and was sitting at her vanity when he entered without knocking. "I trust your sister is well?" he asked, approaching from behind, placing his hands on her shoulders. Margaret flinched at the touch. "As well as can be expected for a widow." "And you? Did the trip restore your health?" Health, that was the word they used. As if her problem was physical rather than spiritual, as if medicine could cure what was fundamentally broken about their marriage and their lives. "I'm quite well, Thomas," she said, reaching for the laudanum bottle on her vanity. He watched her measure out the drops, watched her swallow them with water. "You know I only want what's best for you," he said. "For our family." "Of course. The harvest is going exceptionally well. I've made some new investments. There will be additional revenue this year." She said nothing, just stared at her reflection in the mirror, a woman she barely recognized, trapped in a life she'd never wanted but had been raised to accept. "I've acquired a new houseworker," Thomas continued, his tone too casual. To help Mama Ruth. The girl has some education, can read and write. I thought she might be useful for household management." Margaret's eyes met his in the mirror. She'd heard this speech before, knew exactly what houseworker meant. "I see," she said quietly. "You needn't concern yourself with her. She's housed separately, won't interfere with your household." Won't interfere. As if that were possible. As if Margaret didn't know about every enslaved woman Thomas had violated over the years. As if she hadn't learned to turn a blind eye to preserve whatever remained of her dignity and status. "As you wish," she said, because what else could she say? Objecting would accomplish nothing except her own humiliation. Better to pretend ignorance, to maintain the fiction of her marriage, to protect her children's inheritance and social standing. Thomas bent and kissed the top of her head. "You're a good wife, Margaret. I appreciate your understanding." After he left, Margaret sat at her vanity long into the night, waiting for the laudanum to pull her under. Through her window, she could see the cottage where the new girl lived. A lamp burned in the window. Margaret wondered if the girl knew what she was part of, if she understood that she was just the latest chapter in a story that had been repeating since the plantation's founding. 3 days after Margaret's return, the two women finally met. It happened in the garden behind the main house, where roses bloomed in careful rows and mint grew wild along the fence. Celeste had been walking, one of her few permitted freedoms, when she rounded a corner and found herself face to face with Thomas's wife. They stared at each other for a long moment. Margaret saw a beautiful girl with mixed heritage, young enough to be her daughter, wearing a dress that Margaret recognized as having come from her husband's coin. Celeste saw a woman destroyed by knowledge, by compromise, by a system that trapped everyone inside it in different ways. "You're the new girl," Margaret said, her voice neither kind nor cruel, simply factual. "Yes, ma'am." "Celeste." Margaret nodded slowly, taking in every detail. The girl's youth, her defiant eyes that hadn't yet learned complete submission, the way she held herself with dignity despite everything. "You can read and write, I'm told." "Yes, ma'am." "A dangerous skill for someone in your position." Celeste said nothing, understanding the warning beneath the words. Margaret stepped closer, spoke in a voice just above a whisper. "I won't pretend not to know why you're here. I won't pretend to like it. But I won't make your life more difficult than it already is. As long as you stay away from my children, as long as you remain invisible to my world, we won't have problems." "I understand, ma'am." "Do you?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I doubt you understand anything yet. But you will. Time teaches lessons here that no one wants to learn." She walked away then, leaving Celeste standing alone among the roses, feeling the full weight of her isolation. She wasn't part of the enslaved community in the quarters. She wasn't part of the main house. She existed in limbo, claimed by a man who didn't truly see her, tolerated by a wife who saw too much. That night, Mama Ruth came to the cottage again, this time with fresh bread and information. "The mistress is back," she said unnecessarily. "You met her today." "Yes, ma'am." Ruth set down the bread, then grabbed Celeste's hand with surprising strength. "Listen to me, child. Things are going to get more complicated now. The wife knows about you, which means the children will know soon, which means the whole plantation will be talking. You keep your head down. Don't give nobody reason to notice you more than they already have. I'm trying to stay invisible, Mama Ruth." "Invisible?" The old woman shook her head. "You can't be invisible when you wear his attention like a brand. People are going to talk. They're going to speculate. They're going to—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd said too much. "Going to what?" Ruth released her hand and stepped back. "Just be careful. That's all I'm saying. Be careful." But careful wasn't enough anymore. The whispers had already begun. In the quarters, people spoke in low voices about the girl in the cottage, about her resemblance to someone they'd known long ago, about the tragic poetry of history repeating itself. The older folks who remembered Lizette looked at Celeste and saw the ghost of a woman who died screaming 18 years ago. And somewhere in the main house, in a study filled with ledgers and deeds and documents that proved ownership of human beings, Thomas Beaumont sat alone with a glass of bourbon, staring at nothing, trying to ignore the voice in the back of his mind that whispered questions he didn't want to answer. Samuel Hayes had been overseer at Magnolia Plantation for 8 years. He was a hard man from poor white stock, someone who'd climbed from nothing to a position of relative power through cruelty and cunning. He managed 200 enslaved workers with systematic brutality, understanding that his authority depended on maintaining fear. At 40 years old, he'd never married, drank heavily, and harbored ambitions that would never be realized because men like Thomas Beaumont would never truly accept him as an equal. He'd noticed the new girl immediately. Hard not to. She lived in a cottage that had previously been empty, wore dresses too fine for field work, and commanded Thomas's attention in ways that made Hayes both jealous and calculating. Hayes understood plantation politics, understood that information was currency, and he'd spent 8 years collecting secrets about the Beaumont family that he kept stored away like ammunition for an uncertain future. He'd been 16 when Lizette died, working as a field hand under his father who'd been overseer before him. He remembered the scandal, though it had been kept quiet, of Thomas's involvement with the enslaved woman. He remembered the baby being sold away, the deliberate erasure of evidence. And now, looking at Celeste, he saw what Thomas apparently couldn't or wouldn't see, the unmistakable resemblance. One morning in late October, as the sugar harvest reached its peak and the mill ran day and night, Hayes found Mama Ruth near the smokehouse. She was supervising the younger women preparing food for the field workers who labored in 12-hour shifts cutting cane. "Ruth," he said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Need to talk to you." The old woman stiffened but didn't show fear. 42 years had taught her how to navigate dangerous men. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hayes? That new girl. Celeste. Where'd she come from exactly?" "Mr. Beaumont bought her in New Orleans. That's all I know." Hayes stepped closer, dropped his voice. "Don't play stupid with me, old woman. You know something. I can see it every time you look at her. Like you seen a ghost." Ruth kept her face carefully neutral. "I don't know what you mean, sir. How old is she?" 17, I believe. 17. Hayes did the math slowly, visibly. "And she was born in Louisiana originally, then sold to Mississippi." "That right. I wouldn't know about that, sir." He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to bruise but firm enough to make his point. "Listen carefully, Ruth. I know things about this plantation that could cause Mr. Beaumont considerable embarrassment. But I also know when to keep my mouth shut, for the right price. Now, is that girl who I think she is?" Ruth met his eyes steadily. "I can't answer what I don't know. Can't or won't. Is there a difference that matters, Mr. Hayes?" He released her arm, frustrated. "You're playing a dangerous game, old woman. If I'm right about this, and if certain people find out what I know, then you'll what? Tell Mr. Beaumont he's been." She stopped, unable to say it aloud. "You think he'll thank you for that information? You think he'll reward you for destroying his reputation and his peace of mind?" Hayes hadn't considered that angle. He'd been thinking about blackmail, about leveraging knowledge for money or position. But Ruth was right. Thomas Beaumont wouldn't want to know this truth. And revealing it publicly would destroy the Beaumont family's standing in Louisiana society, which would in turn destroy Hayes's position and livelihood. "So we all just pretend nothing's wrong," he said bitterly. "We survive, Mr. Hayes. That's what we do. We survive another day in a world that wasn't built for truth." He walked away frustrated, but Ruth's words had planted doubt. For now, he would watch and wait. But secrets this volatile had a way of exploding eventually, and Hayes intended to be positioned advantageously when that happened. Meanwhile, Celeste's isolation was becoming unbearable. She spent hours alone in the cottage, waiting for Thomas's visits with a mixture of dread and resignation. She tried to maintain some sense of self, some core of identity that couldn't be violated, but it was becoming harder. Each night he came, each time he touched her, she felt pieces of herself breaking away like ice calving from a glacier. She'd discovered that the cottage had a loose floorboard near the bed. Beneath it was a small hollow space where she began hiding things. A pencil she'd found, scraps of paper, small stones from the garden that she arranged in patterns that meant something only to her. It was a tiny rebellion, a secret space that was hers alone. One afternoon, Thomas's youngest son James wandered near the cottage. He was 9 years old, curious and sheltered, unaware of the adult complexities around him. He'd been playing near the garden and had followed a butterfly to Celeste's door. She was sitting outside, enjoying rare sunshine, when he appeared. They stared at each other, the enslaved woman and the master's son, separated by an unbridgeable gulf of power and circumstance. "Hello," James said with the innocent directness of childhood. "You're the new lady." Celeste didn't know how to respond. Talking to the master's children was forbidden. But he was just a boy, standing there with dirt on his knees and curiosity in his eyes. "Hello," she said carefully. "Do you live here? In this cottage?" "Yes." "By yourself? Isn't that lonely?" The question, so innocent, so accidentally profound, nearly broke her composure. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I get lonely too," James confided. "My brother and sister are older. They don't want to play with me anymore." Before Celeste could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "James, get away from there immediately." Margaret Beaumont stood on the path, her face pale with anger and fear. She rushed forward, grabbed her son's hand, and pulled him away from Celeste as if she were poisonous. "But mother, I was just..." "Not another word. Inside. Now." She dragged the protesting boy toward the main house, but not before giving Celeste a look that contained warning, fear, and something that might have been pity. After they were gone, Celeste sat frozen, realizing how precarious her position truly was. Any contact with the family, even innocent, could be interpreted as overstepping, as threat. That evening, Thomas arrived at the cottage earlier than usual, his face dark with anger. "You spoke to my son." "He came to me, sir." "I said almost nothing." "I don't care who initiated it. You will never speak to my children. Do you understand?" "Never." "Yes, sir." He grabbed her chin, forced her to look at him. "Your place is here. In this cottage. You don't exist beyond these walls. You're nothing but what I say you are. Remember that." After he left, Celeste sat on the floor and finally allowed herself to cry. Not for the harshness of his words, she'd heard worse. Not even for the violation of her body, she'd learned to disconnect from that. But for the absolute totality of her isolation, for the understanding that she was utterly alone in a world that wanted her invisible, that needed her silent, that required her erasure to maintain its comfortable lies. In the quarters, people talked about the incident with James. Mama Ruth heard about it and felt the weight of knowledge crushing her chest. This couldn't continue. Something had to give. But what? And when? And at what cost? The plantation moved forward into November. The sugar harvest continued. The mill processed cane into raw sugar that would be refined elsewhere, sold elsewhere, consumed by people who would never think about the labor that produced it. And in the cottage behind the main house, Celeste waited and wondered how long a person could survive with their soul systematically destroyed piece by piece. Winter came gently to Louisiana, not with snow but with cool mornings and shorter days. The sugar harvest finished in mid-November, and the plantation settled into quieter rhythms. Margaret had withdrawn further into herself since the incident with James, spending most days in her room with laudanum and silence. Celeste marked the passing weeks by moon phases visible through her cottage window. She'd started keeping a calendar on hidden papers beneath her floorboard, using marks that meant something only to her. It was a way of claiming time, of proving she still existed as more than Thomas Beaumont's possession. The letter arrived on a December morning, delivered by a postal rider from New Orleans. It was addressed to Thomas Beaumont, written in careful script, sent from a cotton factor specializing in slave sales. Thomas opened it in his study, expecting routine business correspondence. What he read made his blood run cold. Dear Mr. Beaumont, in reviewing records following the death of Mr. Clarence Morton of Mississippi, we discovered an irregularity regarding a sale from 1834. A female infant, sold from your plantation to Mr. Morton's estate, was born at Magnolia to an enslaved woman named Lizette, deceased, and sold at approximately 6 months old. This individual was recently resold at auction in New Orleans. The girl would now be approximately 17 or 18 years of age. Physical description notes mixed race heritage, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. We include this information in case you wish to verify chain of title for your records. Thomas read the letter 3 times. The first time, his mind rejected what it was saying. The second time, cold dread settled in his stomach. The third time, he was calculating dates, ages, descriptions. Lizette. He remembered her now, the affair that had seemed insignificant at the time. She'd been beautiful and powerless to refuse him. When she'd gotten pregnant, he'd been annoyed but not concerned. The baby would be sold. Problem solved. He'd forgotten her name. He'd forgotten the child. He'd deliberately erased them both because acknowledging them would have complicated his upcoming marriage to Margaret. Now, 17 years later, that erasure was undone. He walked to his window, looked out at the cottage where Celeste lived. His mistress. His daughter. The room spun. Thomas grabbed the desk for support. It wasn't possible. But the dates matched. The description matched. The chain from Magnolia to Mississippi to New Orleans closed in a perfect, terrible circle. What had he done? For the first time in his adult life, Thomas Beaumont felt genuine horror. Not moral discomfort about slavery or exploitation. He'd rationalized those away long ago. But visceral, personal horror. He'd been sleeping with his own daughter. He'd violated her, repeatedly. He grabbed the chamber pot and vomited. After washing his face, after drinking whiskey to steady his shaking hands, Thomas tried to think clearly. What were his options? Free her and send her away. But that required explanation that would destroy his reputation. Sell her again, but that meant another man would possess her. Or do nothing, keep the secret, maintain the status quo. That night, he didn't visit the cottage. For the first time since bringing Celeste to Magnolia, he stayed away. She waited, confused by his absence, uncertain whether to feel relief or fear. In the main house, Thomas sat alone in his study, drinking bourbon, staring at the fire where he'd burned the letter. Margaret found him near midnight, drunk in a way she'd rarely seen. "Thomas? Are you ill?" He looked up with eyes that held something new. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Margaret, I've done something terrible. The girl, Celeste, in the cottage. I need to send her away." Margaret studied her husband's face and felt cold understanding. "Who is she, Thomas?" He couldn't say it, couldn't speak the words. "Her mother was named Lizette," Thomas said finally. "She died in childbirth, 17 years ago." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. "Oh, Thomas," Margaret said, "what have you done?" He had no answer. In the cottage, Celeste lay awake, wondering why Thomas hadn't come, sensing that something fundamental had shifted. And in the quarters, Mama Ruth lay awake too, Sensing changed the way animals sense storms. Something had broken. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight, they all waited in separate prisons. The master, the wife, the enslaved woman who was both victim and daughter, the old woman who'd carried a secret too long. Sometimes the truth destroys everything it touches. But silence destroys even more. If this story matters to you, your support matters to us. Thomas didn't visit the cottage for 5 days. Celeste existed in suspended anxiety, uncertain what his absence meant but sensing fundamental change. Mama Ruth brought supplies but wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't answer questions. On the 6th day, Thomas finally appeared. He stood in the doorway looking haggard, older, as if he'd aged years in less than a week. He smelled of whiskey but wasn't drunk. He was haunted. "Pack your things," he said without preamble. "You're leaving tomorrow." Celeste's stomach dropped. Leaving meant being sold again, starting over, losing even fragile stability. "Where am I going, sir?" "New Orleans." "You'll be sold outside Louisiana. Probably Texas or Arkansas." "Did I do something wrong?" He laughed bitterly. "Wrong? No, Celeste. This is all my fault." The words made no sense. Masters didn't take responsibility. Something was very wrong. "I don't understand, sir." Thomas walked to the window, looked out at fields he owned, people he owned, the empire built on suffering that had seemed so natural until a letter shattered everything. "You don't need to understand. Just pack." But Celeste had learned to read people, to interpret silences. And something in Thomas's demeanor, the shame, the avoidance, the desperation, triggered realization. All those looks from Mama Ruth. All those whispers. All those times Thomas stared at her with troubled recognition. "Who was my mother?" she asked suddenly. Thomas went rigid. "That's not your concern." "Who was she?" "A woman who died. That's all you need to know." "Where did I come from? Why does everyone look at me like I'm a ghost?" He turned on her, anger flaring. "Stop asking questions. You're a slave. You don't get answers. You get sold and you go quietly and you—" His voice broke. "You survive. Somewhere else. Away from here." Celeste stepped closer, driven by something beyond fear. "Was I born here? At Magnolia?" "Stop. Was my mother named Lisette?" The name froze him completely. He stared at her with horror and confirmation. "How do you know that name?" "I heard whispers. The older people remember." She moved closer. "Who was she? Who was Lisette?" Thomas couldn't speak. He'd spent 5 days trying to figure out how to handle this, settling on removal, on erasure. But now she was asking questions, and lies were impossible. "She was nobody," he said weakly. "Just a girl who died." "And my father?" The question hung like a knife. Thomas looked at Celeste, really looked at her for the first time since the letter. He saw Lisette in her face. He saw his own mother in her cheekbones. He saw himself in her jaw. "Your father," he said slowly, "was a monster who didn't deserve to live." "You knew him?" "I was him." The words fell like stones. Celeste stared, her mind refusing to process. It wasn't possible. But his face, the shame, the guilt, the absolute horror, told her it was true. "No," she said softly. "I didn't know," Thomas said, voice breaking. "I swear I didn't know. When I bought you in New Orleans, I had no idea. I'd forgotten about Lisette, forgotten the baby. And then a letter came, and suddenly I remembered, and I realized what I'd—" He couldn't finish. Celeste backed away, mind reeling. Every night. Every violation. And he was her father. She thought she'd experienced the worst slavery could offer. But this was worse. This was horror beyond naming. "You knew," she said, voice rising. "When the letter came, you knew, and you kept coming here." "No. I stopped. That's why I haven't been here. That's why I'm sending you away. After 5 days. You took 5 days to decide this was wrong." Thomas had no defense. She was right. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words insulted the very concept of apology. Celeste laughed, edged with hysteria. "You're sorry. You raped your own daughter for 3 months, and you're sorry." "I didn't know. Does that matter? Does ignorance erase what you did?" He had no answer. "I'm sending you to New Orleans tomorrow," he said, retreating into logistics. "You'll be freed. Given money. Freed to starve. That's your solution." They stood in silence, father and daughter, master and slave, perpetrator and victim, separated by crimes too vast to bridge. Finally, Celeste spoke. "I want to know about her. About Lisette. About my mother. And I want Mama Ruth freed and sent with me. And I want $1,000. Or I tell everyone what you did." Thomas stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as property, but as a person with agency, with power to hurt him back. "All right," he said. "Ruth goes with you. Freed. $1,000. And I'll tell Ruth the truth." "Good," Celeste said. "Now get out." Morning came cold and gray. Fog rolled off the Mississippi, turning the plantation ghostly. Thomas had the wagon prepared before dawn. A good wagon with covered top, pulled by 2 strong horses. He'd included supplies and a locked box containing $1,000 in gold coins and papers of manumission for both Celeste and Ruth. Mama Ruth came at first light, carrying a small bundle, everything she owned after 42 years at Magnolia. She looked at Celeste with eyes that held too much knowledge. "You ready, child?" "As ready as I'll ever be." They loaded their belongings. Thomas came out looking haggard. Margaret watched from an upstairs window. "The driver knows the way," Thomas said. "He has instructions to deliver you safely." Celeste nodded but didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. But Thomas wasn't finished. "Before you go, you have siblings. Thomas Jr., Catherine, and James. They're your half-siblings. They don't know about you, and they never will. But you should know they exist." The information landed like a blow. She had brothers and a sister. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you asked for truth. This is part of it." Ruth spoke sharply. "Don't you dare talk about belonging. She doesn't belong to you or your family. She belongs to herself now. That's what freedom means." As Celeste climbed into the wagon, she paused and looked back at the plantation. The main house. The sugar mill. The quarters. The cottage where she'd lived in horror. "I hope you remember this," she said to Thomas. "Every day for the rest of your life, I hope you remember what you did. And I hope it destroys you." The wagon rolled north, away from Magnolia, toward New Orleans, toward some version of freedom neither woman understood yet. They rode in silence for the first hour. Finally, Ruth spoke. "You know why I never told you? To protect me." "No. To protect myself. I was afraid if you knew, you'd do something reckless. I chose my peace over your right to know. That makes me complicit." Celeste took the old woman's hand. "You did what you could. Nobody survives this system with innocence intact." Around midday, they stopped to rest. The driver, Moses, built a fire and heated coffee. "What will you do in New Orleans?" Moses asked Ruth. "Find work. I'm old but strong. Maybe work for wages this time." "And you?" he asked Celeste. Learn, maybe. Find work that means something. Try to become more than what was done to me." Moses nodded. "My mama used to say freedom isn't a destination. It's a direction. You just keep walking toward it." That afternoon, they passed a small town where free people of color lived. Children played. Women hung laundry. Men worked in shops. It was a glimpse of what life might be, limited, constrained by racial laws, but distinctly different from bondage. As they finally saw New Orleans in the distance, Ruth turned to Celeste. "Your mama, Lizette, she was strong. Stronger than anybody gave her credit for. You got her strength in you. Don't let what happened define who you become. You're more than his crime. You're more than his daughter. You're Lizette's daughter too. Remember that." Celeste nodded, holding back tears. For the first time, she had history. She had ancestry. She had connection to someone beyond the master who'd violated her. That night, they entered New Orleans. Moses delivered them to a boarding house run by Madame Laveau, who specialized in helping newly freed people. She took one look at them and asked no questions. "You'll be safe here," Madame Laveau said. "Whatever you're running from can't touch you in this house." After she left, Celeste and Ruth sat on their beds, looking at each other. Free. They were actually free. It didn't feel real yet, but it was something. It was a beginning. "Thank you," Celeste said, "for coming with me, for protecting me when you could, for telling me about my mother." Ruth smiled sadly. "We protect each other now, child. That's what family does. And whether Thomas Beaumont likes it or not, we're family. Not by his blood, by our survival." That night, Celeste took out her hidden papers and added new marks. Symbols that meant freedom, that meant escape, that meant the beginning of a story she would write herself. 3 months passed. Winter gave way to spring. New Orleans bloomed with jasmine and magnolia. Celeste and Mama Ruth established a routine in Madame Laveau's boarding house. Ruth worked in the kitchen. Celeste found work as a tutor for free children of color, using her literacy to earn wages. The money Thomas had given them sat mostly untouched in a bank. Insurance against catastrophe, security in a world that offered little to women who looked like them. But the past wasn't finished. The letter arrived in March, addressed to Celeste, written in shaking hand she didn't recognize. "Dear Celeste, you don't know me, but I know you. My name is Margaret Beaumont. I was, Thomas's wife. I write to inform you that Thomas died 2 weeks ago. He took ill with fever and passed quickly. The doctor said pneumonia, but I know better. He died of guilt. He died of shame. He spent his final months drinking himself into oblivion. Before he died, he made changes to his will. A sum of $5,000 has been set aside for you. It is yours by right," he said, though he never explained why. "I know why. I've always known. From the moment I saw you, I knew whose daughter you were. The resemblance was unmistakable. I did nothing. That is my sin. I saw what was happening and chose my comfort, my children's inheritance, my social standing over your protection. I told myself I was powerless, but the truth is I simply didn't try. This money doesn't absolve anything. But I want you to know that what happened to you mattered. That you mattered. I also want you to know that Thomas's children, your half-siblings, will never learn the truth. That secret dies with me. They deserve to remember their father without that horror. And you deserve privacy. I don't ask forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I simply wanted you to know that justice, limited and imperfect as it is, has been done. Thomas died tormented. And I will live tormented by what I failed to do. May you find peace that eluded all of us at Magnolia. Margaret Beaumont." Celeste read the letter 3 times. Thomas was dead. The man who'd fathered her, enslaved her, violated her, He was gone. The threat he represented had evaporated. She showed Ruth, who read slowly. "He's dead," Ruth said. "Lord have mercy. Does that change anything?" Ruth considered carefully. "It changes nothing about what happened. But it changes everything about what might happen. You don't have to fear him finding you. You're truly free now." The $5,000 arrived a week later. Combined with the original $1,000, Celeste now had enough to ensure survival for years, to make choices based on desire rather than desperation. That evening, they sat in the courtyard, listening to music drift from nearby taverns. New Orleans was alive with sound. "What will you do now?" Ruth asked. "There's a school here. 4 free children of color. They need teachers. I could do that. Teach children to read, give them tools to navigate this world." "That's good work. Important work. And I want to write down what happened. Not for publication. Nobody would believe it anyway. But for the record. So there's testimony. So it's not like it never happened." Ruth nodded slowly. "Bearing witness. That matters. Will you tell me more about my mother? Everything you remember." So Ruth talked. She talked about Lizette's singing voice, about how she tried to teach enslaved children to read despite the danger, about her kindness, her strength, her dignity, about her pregnancy, her joy at feeling the baby move despite knowing the child would be taken, about her death, painful and prolonged, witnessed by Ruth who held her hand. "She loved you," Ruth said. "In those 3 days before she died, she held you and loved you fiercely. She named you Celeste. It means heavenly, because she said you were too beautiful for this terrible world." Celeste wiped tears. "I wish I'd known her. She lives in you, child. Every time you survive something impossible, that's her. Every time you refuse to be broken, that's her strength." Over the following months, Celeste began teaching. She discovered aptitude for it. Her students adored her. She built community, purpose, connection. At night, she wrote, page after page of testimony. What had happened at Magnolia, what slavery was really like, what violations occurred in spaces between legal transactions and polite society. Clear-eyed documentation of truth. She didn't know if anyone would read it, but that wasn't the point. The point was creating record, refusing erasure, bearing witness. We're almost at the end. If you've made it this far, if you've witnessed this truth with us, please subscribe. Stories like these need to be told, remembered, and passed forward. 10 years after leaving Magnolia, Celeste stood in the courtyard of the school where she now served as headmistress. She was 27, unmarried by choice, respected in New Orleans's free community of color. The Civil War had begun. Distant thunder everyone knew would arrive eventually. Mama Ruth had died 2 years earlier, peacefully at age 73. Celeste had buried her in a cemetery for free people, paid for a proper headstone. Ruth Du Bois, teacher, mother, witness. The name Du Bois was Ruth's choosing after freedom. It meant, from the woods. Celeste missed her daily. Ruth had been mother, grandmother, compass. But Ruth had died free, having built something meaningful, knowing she'd protected one last child. The school had grown. What started as one classroom now occupied an entire building with 5 teachers and 90 students. They taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, preparing children for a world that might finally acknowledge their humanity. One afternoon in March 1862, a Union officer arrived. He'd heard about Celeste's decade-old testimony, wanted to interview her for a report about slavery's realities. They talked for 3 hours. She told him everything, about Magnolia, about Thomas and Margaret, about her mother Lizette, about the networks of violation that made slavery function, about children sold from mothers, casual violence, sexual exploitation everyone knew about but nobody stopped. "How did you survive?" he asked. By refusing to disappear, she said. By insisting I was human even when everyone treated me like property. By finding people like Mama Ruth who protected what they could. By writing it down so it couldn't be erased. And forgiveness? Celeste laughed bitterly. Forgiveness is what powerful people demand of the powerless. It's how they ease guilt without making restitution. Thomas Beaumont is dead. He faced no consequences. His children inherited his wealth. His name is still respected. Why would I offer forgiveness when justice was never attempted? The officer had no answer. That evening, Celeste returned to the house she'd purchased. It was modest but comfortable. The walls lined with books. She'd educated herself voraciously over the decade. She pulled out her journals, now filling several volumes. She wrote about nightmares that still woke her, about difficulty trusting men, about complicated grief when her father died, relief mixed with anger that he'd escaped real accountability, about wondering what her half-siblings were like. She also wrote about joy, students who learned to read, community gatherings, moments when she forgot what had been done to her and simply existed in the present, friendships with formerly enslaved people who understood without explanation. When Union forces captured New Orleans in April 1862, newly freed people flooded the city. Celeste's school became refuge. She and her teachers worked overtime, teaching literacy, helping people navigate bureaucracy. One day, a woman arrived with a child of 8. Rail-thin, clearly sick, desperate to ensure her daughter had education before she died. Celeste took them in. The woman died 3 weeks later. The child, Marie, stayed with Celeste, became the daughter she'd never planned to have. "Tell me about your mother," Marie asked one evening. "My mother was brave," Celeste said. "She survived things that should have killed her spirit. She loved me in the short time she had. And she taught me that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you." In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was abolished, Celeste was 32. She'd spent 15 years in freedom, 15 years proving she was more than what had been done to her. The school thrived. Marie grew strong. The community held together. That spring, she received a letter from Catherine Beaumont, her half-sister. Catherine's mother had told her certain truths before dying. "I cannot undo what was done to you. But I wanted you to know that not all of our family is defined by those choices. Magnolia is failing. I will not maintain it. I intend to sell the land and use proceeds to establish a school for formerly enslaved children. If you are willing, I would like to meet you." They met 6 months later in New Orleans. They talked for hours, about Thomas, about Margaret, about Lisette, about the impossible complexity of inheritance. They didn't become close, but they acknowledged each other's humanity. Catherine kept her promise. Magnolia was sold. The proceeds funded a school that still operates today, teaching children whose ancestors worked that land as slaves. Celeste lived until 1892, dying at 59. She'd spent 41 years in freedom, building a life that mattered, refusing to be defined by horror. She'd taught hundreds of children, written testimony historians would later discover, created community that survived her. Marie inherited Celeste's journals and legacy. She continued the school, passed forward the story of a woman who'd survived the impossible. And somewhere in the soil of Magnolia, now transformed into a school where children's laughter echoed, Lisette's spirit finally rested. Her daughter had survived. Her daughter had thrived. Her daughter had taken the worst slavery could devise and transmuted it into testimony, teaching, refusal. That was the legacy that mattered. Some stories don't have happy endings. They have true endings. They have survival. They have witness. They have refusal to be erased. This is one of those stories. Thank you for bearing witness. If this mattered to you, if you believe these truths need to be told and retold, Please subscribe, share, and remember, the past shapes us only as much as we let it. Celeste chose to shape herself. That choice was her freedom.